And now, a show with inappropriate language. The Powell Movement.
Welcome to the Powell Movement. I'm your host, Mike Powell, and this week it's back to mountain biking. And my guest, Thomas Vanderham, has been a fixture in the world of freeride since he was 15 years old. But Thomas is no has-been. Now at 35 years old, he still charges as hard as ever, and his signature whip only gets better over time. Thomas doesn't do that many interviews. He's one of those guys who's always let his riding do the talking. So it was a privilege to get an hour of his time. But before we get into the podcast, I need to thank Dan and Nick over at Stanley. They brought me in the office the other day, showed me around, and then they put me in a room full of everything that Stanley makes and said, "Take what you want. We'll be back in 5 minutes." Man, that is the best way to do free stuff. I took 4 pint glasses, 2 water bottles, and a coffee cup and felt totally greedy. While you're not going to get into that room of free stuff, you can get set up with a big discount from Stanley and Spy for that matter by using the codes in the ads that you'll find in the podcast. I also need to thank my other great sponsors who make the podcast happen, Evo and the 10 Barrel Brewery. Finally, I want to ask you to follow me on Instagram at The Powell Movement and subscribe to my podcast on whatever platform you listen to me on. Now, let's talk with Thomas Vanderham. It sounds like your Anthill movie, Return to Earth, is available for purchase. I think it's going to happen tomorrow. And when I say tomorrow, it's next week when the podcast will release, so it'll be on iTunes. I haven't seen the movie, but how has the reaction been so far for it?
It's been awesome. I saw it myself for the very first time at the world premiere in Vancouver, and it was received really well. And then I went on a short premiere tour with those guys through Colorado and California, and people seem to really like it. It's definitely an entertaining watch. I'm really stoked with how it came out.
How old are you now?
I'm 35.
35 years old. You've probably done premiere tours since you were 20.
Yeah.
Do they get old?
I haven't been on that many premiere tours per se, like touring around to multiple stops. I really enjoyed this one, to be honest with you. It was really cool to just visit different mountain bike communities and see like genuine stoke on people's faces. And we did a bit of riding and got to hang with some locals, and it was great. I enjoyed it.
When you go to those mountain biking communities, the way that people recognize you in different places, I'm sure you can go into a city and you're not going to get recognized by a ton of people. But the second you get to a mountain biking town, is it automatically people are looking at you and you can feel it?
Sometimes, maybe. It's a pretty small community, mountain bike world. So I do think, a lot of people recognize you. But then again, there's often times where people don't recognize you. Yeah.
And you've worked with the guys at Anthill since the collective, and I would think it's pretty much second nature working with them. When you go out on a project, any project with them, are there any surprises, or is it pretty much working with really good friends?
I wouldn't say necessarily there are surprises. I would just say that every film and every concept for each different segment differs slightly. So that's what makes it interesting and keeps it fun. It kind of feels like every movie is its own challenge in some different way. That's definitely what keeps it fun. And also, they do feel like old friends at this point. We've been working together for a long time, so it's good to work with people you're comfortable with.
When you go out with a crew that you haven't worked with before, like if someone sets something up with mainstream media who might not totally get what you're all about and what you do you ever end up in uncomfortable situation where maybe they send a huge crew and you're in a remote area and you're like, what the hell's going on here?
Well, it certainly has happened. Yeah. I mean, for the most part, I've been pretty lucky with that, and I haven't ended up on too many projects that I'm not totally comfortable with. But I have done a few things in sort of the more mainstream media. At one point, I got cast in a deodorant commercial, and that was a completely different experience, working on a huge set with like 40 people around, and it was just a totally different experience.
And I'm sure you're thinking, hey, we can get this footage with my 2 cameramen that I usually work with because they know where to be.
It crossed my mind, yeah.
And I would think the video game, among a lot of other things in your career, has changed significantly since you got in. I mean, when you started, people were shooting with GLs and VXs, I would think. Nowadays, you've got cable systems and crazy cameras. And in a world where there's a lot of hurry up and wait, which I think in any filming situation there is, when you have some of the new technology, does that even extend the hurry up and wait?
it can have both effects. I was talking to somebody about this the other day. It has changed so much. I mean, we started shooting on little digital, like Handycam style videos, and then started working with the bigger productions, and it was all 16 millimeter. And you'd shoot for months and months and months and not transfer any film. So you didn't know anything about what you got. That's a crazy experience. You know, I've heard stories about those guys going into film transfers and figuring out that they didn't load one roll of film properly and whole rolls of film would be ruined. And that's a totally different game than it is now, when you can just check the back of the screen, rewatch the shot. Oh, did we get it? Did we not get it? Let's try it again. Yeah, it couldn't be any different, really.
When someone would lose a whole roll of film and you lose 10 tricks that you worked really hard to get, along with a ton of slams that go with them, how frustrating is that to the writer?
Yeah, it's definitely really frustrating. I can't say that I had that happen to me specifically, but I have heard stories of that nature. So, you know, as a writer, you always have maybe that one take that you were super stoked on, and maybe that one didn't quite work out and doesn't make the cut. So that's a tough pill to swallow sometimes, but I guess it's just part of the business.
When you mention the business, and I'm mentioning things that have changed over your career, and it's all really based on technology, I feel like the marketing of athletes has changed just as much as the filming since you started. I mean, you really didn't have to think about marketing yourself back in the day. You really just had to ride well, call people back, and give a few appearance days. But now everything's changed with social media, and you still have to have your writing game, but now people want you to post shit. They want content. They want you to create content. And has that made your job a whole lot more than it used to be?
It's definitely changed significantly, and there's positives and negatives. I mean, yeah, we used to work for a whole year or a whole season on a 3-minute video part and put everything we had into that video part, and then it would come out once a year, and that was really the game. And it's evolved a lot from that. Obviously, the way that media is consumed now, you want a lot more frequency than just once a year. I myself try to sort of still focus on maybe a handful of bigger projects rather than work on something every week or even every month. I still sort of try to put a lot of time and effort into less projects. And then social media, I mean, I think everyone uses it a bit differently. And for me, I try to use it mostly to showcase some of those bigger projects. So it's a medium for me to get that work out there. But yeah, I'll be the first to admit it's a bigger part of my job than I wish it was.
It doesn't seem like you're one of those look at me, look what I've done type of guys. You let the movie companies and your sponsors do that throughout your career. So now having to take that and you're almost expected to do that a little bit, it doesn't really feel like it lines up with your personality, but it's part of the job.
It is. I am maybe a little bit more of a private person. I don't necessarily like putting my life out there online. So when it comes to social media, I do keep it quite professional and maybe a little less personal. But yeah, it is also a really cool way to interact with people. And I have heard from all kinds of fans around the world. And there's a really good side to it too. So I can't say it's all bad.
Yeah, and in the terms of marketing you've never really been marketed based on personality. It's all been your style and fucking really big whips. And the final thing I'll talk about with social media is, do you pay attention to things like likes? Do you post a photo and are you ever like, wow, a lot of people like that one?
Sure, I do, yeah. I'm always interested at what type of photos get maybe more likes than I expected, or potentially the other way around. So yeah, I follow it a bit. It is, as you said, it's part of the job now. So I do try to do it well and watch what works and maybe what doesn't.
Well, that is enough about your social media. We'll talk about your childhood a bit. You grew up in Edmonton, Alberta. It doesn't sound like there's any mountains there. It sounds like it's really cold. Wayne Gretzky played hockey there, and he left what would have been a dynasty. What other good parts are there about Edmonton?
I loved growing up there, to be honest. I didn't know anything else at the time. And it was cold in the summer.
In the summer?
Sorry, it was cold in the winter. Pardon me.
I was going to say, it's got to be really tough if it's cold in the summer, too.
No, it was really hot in the summer. I really enjoyed it, and I didn't really find mountain biking until a bit later. My mom loves to tell this story, but she asked me for like my 7th, 8th, and 9th birthday if I wanted a bike, and I didn't. And I kept saying no, and then we moved houses, and we ended up moving across the street from this guy who basically single-handedly got me into the sport. His name was Pete Zablotny, and he was just an amazing rider himself, and I saw him doing a wheelie all the way up the alley one day and just thought, man, that is the coolest thing I've ever seen. So then for my 10th birthday, I asked my mom for a bike, and it went from there.
When you get your first bike at 10, I think that bike lasts you like a couple weeks. I mean, it's not something that you have for a long time. What happens to that first bike?
Yeah. I set out to learn how to wheelie right away, and I would just spend hours doing wheelies on this bike. It was a Raleigh rigid bike, and I ended up breaking the frame in half after maybe 2 or 3 weeks, and my mom was pretty unhappy with that. So she said I was buying my bikes from that point on, and luckily that neighbor, Pete, he had an old steel frame that he sold me for next to nothing. That was my bike from then on. I never broke that one.
That neighbor, I mean, how much older is he than you?
At the time, he's probably like around 30, and I was 10.
That's illegal in most countries.
Well, we became great friends. We rode lots together. We ended up going to races together, and he was a real mentor for me. I owe him a lot.
So are you getting into the race scene at 10, 11, 12, 13 through him?
Well, yeah. So in Edmonton, as you mentioned, not many mountains around, but all the terrain is within the banks of the river valley. There's a big river that runs through the city. So lots of the trails sort of meander up and down the banks of the river. And there was a local bike shop that ran this awesome weekly slalom race on the ski hill. And the ski hill had maybe like 30 meters of vertical or something. Like it is a tiny hill with a little rope tow, but every week in the summer, they would set up this slalom course with just ski gates and grass. No built features, no jumps or anything. And they were amazing. And I started to do those at a pretty young age. And that was my introduction into racing. And then, yeah, I raced pretty consistently till I was a pro, basically, like all through junior. I raced a ton. I went to the Worlds as a junior.
So you're on track to do really well in racing if you decide to continue.
I was a good racer. I wouldn't say I was a great racer. I attribute a lot of my bike skills to racing. I would say, yeah, I wouldn't be where I am without racing for sure. And I showed potential for sure, but I was also just always not taking the fastest line on the course and kind of looking for the most fun lines, jumping off of things and airing over stuff and not totally focused on the result.
Are you playing any other sports as well, or is it just getting into biking at 10?
Yeah, I did. I grew up playing most of the sports. I was definitely always really, really into lots of the team sports. I played a ton of soccer. Actually, hockey was one that I didn't play much. My mom had pretty strong feelings about hockey.
Is she not Canadian?
You know what? She's not Canadian.
Okay, that makes sense.
She was born in the U.S., but I think particularly because it was Edmonton, and as you mentioned, that was the time when they were winning a bunch of Stanley Cups and Gretzky, and everybody sort of thought their kid was going to be the next Gretzky. So it was super competitive, and she just wasn't down with that scene. So I got to play lots of other sports, grew up playing soccer and basketball and all kinds of other things, but never played hockey competitively.
At this point, you're 13, 14, you're still in Edmonton. Are you watching videos and reading the magazines, and are you aware of the scene that's happening on the West Coast?
I started to be, yeah. That was all kind of right around that time when it was happening. I do remember very distinctly seeing Cranked One for the first time playing in a bike shop and just being totally amazed by it. And my parents, for Christmas one year, they got me a subscription to Bike Magazine. That was really cool to start flipping through that magazine and look at all the images and read the articles. And then one day my parents came home and said that we were moving to Vancouver, and that month's issue of Bike Magazine was a now like quite famous issue with a big feature on the North Shore. And I just could not believe that that's where we were moving.
There was no being upset leaving Edmonton. It was just getting stoked because you realize you're going to the best terrain in the world.
Yeah, I would say I was pretty stoked. A little bummed to leave some friends behind, but I was stoked.
And at this point, have all the other sports fell to the wayside? Is it all biking by the time you get to Vancouver?
No, I played a lot of sports competitively right through high school. Basketball all the way through high school and soccer. And I was still super into those sports. And to this day, actually, still am. I'm a bit of a sports junkie, I guess. Which is kind of funny because I've heard from a lot of other people in mountain biking kind of a bit of a anti-team sports sentiment. Like, you know, I tried this when I was younger and it just wasn't for me. And I wanted to do something more individual. But I loved every minute of my time playing team sports and still follow it all. And yeah.
When you first get to Vancouver and you take your first trip out to see some of the trails that you've been reading about, is there any intimidation on your end? Just, holy shit, this is so much bigger than anything I've ever experienced, or is it just pure excitement?
It was pure excitement. I do remember my dad had told me that there was a neighbor we were moving in next to there, a young guy my age that mountain biked. So when we showed up, we drove from Alberta to BC, and we showed up and I pulled into the driveway and I pulled my bike out, and this neighbor was basically waiting for me to arrive. He had his bike gear on. He was sitting there ready to go, and we went for a ride right away.
Oh, that's so rad.
Yeah, it was awesome. And, I'd read those articles and I'd seen North Shore Extreme 1, and I knew that skinnies were a big thing. So I had started to practice riding on curbs outside my house in Edmonton. And we rode Boogeyman, which is a pretty old and famous trail here on Mount Seymour. Yeah, I was just totally excited to see it in person and see these log rides and features that I had seen photos of in the magazines. It was kind of a surreal experience.
Is this around the time that you start working at the Cove Bike Shop?
Yeah, it was shortly thereafter. I would have started to hang around the Cove, and they probably just got so sick of me hanging around the shop that they offered me a job putting bikes together in the back.
And is that how you start meeting a lot of people within the scene, or is you meet them through riding?
Bit of both. The bike shop was great to meet some people. I met Wade there. Wade was working there at the time. Wade's obviously gone on to be, a guy that I spent a lot of time with and ridden with and been teammates with at Rocky for a lot of years. I met Gabe Fox and Andrew Chandro and a few other people through the shop. And then through riding, it was more, there weren't many mountain bikers at my high school. We had a pretty tight crew of guys, and a lot of them also went on to be athletes or have jobs in the outdoor industry. I rode a lot with the Manley twins, and Jordan Manley went on to become a super amazing photographer and filmmaker.
Yeah.
And I also rode a lot with Manuel Osborne Parody, who raced downhill ski raced at 4 or 5 Olympics now or something.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, we had a tight crew. It was funny looking back.
Did you ski a lot too back then?
Yeah, I did ski a lot, and I have skied for longer than I've mountain biked, but I was never nearly as good on my skis as I am on my bike.
Was the bike just a natural thing from the time you were figuring out a wheelie? It just felt right?
I would say so.
I feel like a big person in your career that you meet early on is Sterling Lawrence. He's a little bit older, and I would think he's got connections, and you end up shooting with him. Do you become one of his go-to dudes, and is that how people get to figure out who you are outside of BC?
Yeah, I started working with Searle right around the time that his photography career was taken off. I remember the first time we shot together, he had recently got his first cover of Bike magazine, which was this amazing shot of Eric Van Drimmelen on the Reaper log and the foggy, I think it was a photo annual cover. And we just started to work together a ton. We were both pretty keen to get out and shoot all the time. And yeah, we have done a lot of shooting over the years.
Now it is time for me to take a quick sponsor break. And my first sponsor is Evo. And Evo is a store I've been shopping at since 2001. I've always gone there because the people who work there never act too cool. They're kind of the people that are stoked and genuinely want to help. They're like that in all of their stores. Denver, Portland, Whistler, and of course my Seattle store. Their website, evo.com, offers just as much information and all the brands, product, and service for your bike, skate, surf, camp, ski, or snowboard needs. They also offer free shipping on orders over $50, a low price guarantee, and a no-hassle return policy. Evo was started by a good friend, professional skier Bryce Phillips, and they have supported me since day one. Please support them by buying everything you need for your adventures from Evo. My next sponsor is Stanley, another iconic Seattle brand that has been ahead of the curve since 1913. And while we all know Stanley for creating that green bottle that kept your grandpa's coffee hot all day long, they still do that and a lot more these days. When my kid thinks of a Stanley, he's going to remember the beer pint that kept his dad's beer cold for 4 hours, or the classic legendary bottle that magically keeps hot chocolate hot for over 2 full days. But we should all be thinking about Stanley when we drink water. Their water bottles are the best in class, and they are the right choice for the environment. And now, you can save 30% on all products from Stanley when you head over to stanley-pmi.com, buy some stuff, and when you check out, enter the code POWEL, the number 30, and that's all one word, and you're done. make a difference, save some money, and those are my sponsors. So now we will jump back into the podcast. You're 15 years old, and everything starts to happen really, really fast. You get some shots with Sterling. How does the progression go of you starting to film?
I started shooting with Sterling, and me and my buddies there, the guys I mentioned, like the Manley twins, we always had little handy cams, and we would try and make our own movies. We were always pretty into that kind of stuff. And then I think the first film that I shot with outside of my friends was for North Shore Extreme, which was Digger's series of films. From there, I think my first big shoot was, we had a plan with Digger to go out and shoot some stuff, and Wade was going to come along, and he brought Yurley Ricker as well. And Yurley had just put out a film called Shift, which I was just such a huge fan of, and I had just like worn out the VHS tape. And he was working on a new film called Ride to the Hills. And I ended up on this shoot with Wade and Digger and Yurley were both filming, and it went really well. I hit a bigger drop than I'd ever done. And from there, Yurley invited me out to do some more shooting for his new film. So that was kind of the first big one. And then from there, I do remember being asked to be part of the intro for Crank 3, which was kind of my first introduction to Rocky Mountain, because at the time I was still on a bike that I had purchased, and they needed a young kid for this intro. It was kind of goofy, like it was this spoof kind of theme intro.
The video game theme?
Yeah, that's right, that one. And they needed me to ride a Rocky Mountain, so they put me on a borrowed pipeline. And yeah, that was sort of the very first introduction to Rocky. And then Wade from there sort of helped me become sponsored one day.
And how do they treat a little kid like that? Because everybody's a lot older than you. Are you treated like one of the guys? Or are you the one that they're just messing with? Or is it a novelty having a kid like you who they know is going to have a huge future? How do they react to you?
Rocky Mountain, you mean? Or the other guys on the team?
Just the other riders.
Well, I did most of my riding with Wade at that point because he was local. He was around the Cove a lot. And both Brett and Richie, well, they lived elsewhere at the time. So I didn't really meet those guys for the first little while of riding for Rocky. And then I ended up on a few trips and shoots with them and got to know them a little better. And I don't know, I think they were stoked to have someone young around, and I certainly wasn't picked on or anything like that. They were always good to me.
At this time you're in high school, I would think filming starts ramping up for you. You're starting to get sponsors. Rocky Mountain, I think you've hooked up with Sombrio at that point. What happens with school? It sounds like you played sports, so it must not have impacted your sports schedule. But are you still able to get all your work done when you're doing 3-week stretches of travel or whenever that starts?
Yeah, it started to kick in a little bit in grade 12 in my last year in high school, where I was asked that year to go to Mexico to film with Cranked. I guess that might have been Cranked 4.
Did you guys jump the wall?
No wall in those days. So that was like a 2-week trip, and I do remember like leaving and taking my textbooks with me on that trip and having to like study and do homework while I was down there filming, and kind of a strange situation. But overall, I wouldn't say it affected my schooling too much in high school. It was more once I graduated high school and I had a decision to make, and my parents certainly always wanted me to go to college, and that was always my plan as well. So I started at a local college here, and that's where it really became tough. I was being asked to go on a lot of trips, a lot of shoots, and after only one semester, I sort of had to revisit the subject because it just wasn't working. I didn't feel like I could give school the energy that it required, as well as give biking the energy that it required in order to do them both to the best of my ability.
Understood. And your parents, at this point, they have to realize that something's brewing within the bike world. Are you making any money yet, or are you just getting free products?
I'm just getting free products at that point, but I do remember sitting down with Rocky at that point and sort of explaining to them that if I'm not going to go to school, I need to start making something in terms of money, because this is what I'm going to be doing. This is what I'm going to be giving all my time to. I think I equated it to like working part-time at a restaurant or something. I'm like, I have to start making something. So that was the sort of kicking off point. Yeah, it wasn't much to start with, but at least it was a start.
Yeah, at least you know that the checks are only going to get bigger if you get better. And the sport's so young that it hasn't exploded in terms of sales yet. So, I mean, everything's about to happen for, I think, all the athletes involved, because right now there's not that much revenue in mountain biking, but it's going to come in a year or two. And I would think you could probably feel the excitement of the sport.
Definitely. I was certainly a second generation free rider. I grew up idolizing the guys that I ended up on the team with, and I was so excited about this sort of new style of riding that they were doing, and it was a really exciting time. And the bikes were coming along, and took a little bit for them to catch up and be able to handle the abuse that we were putting them through.
Right.
But it was certainly an exciting time in the sport.
From here out in your career, I mean, starting here, it seems like filming is what you're all about. I mean, you make your name through people seeing your style on film on the big screen. And for me, I come from the snow sports side of things. And in that world, you usually film with who your hard goods sponsor tells you to film with. I mean, you might have a little bit of input, but a brand's going to say, you're going to film with MSP this year. We wrote them a check, and you're going to be going on these trips, connect with Murray and figure out what you need to do. And you're going to be in their movie. Does it work that way in the bike world as well, where the brands are funding the movies and the athletes are picked by the brands to be in the movies?
Yeah, I would say so to a certain degree. That the who sponsors the film certainly has some weight on who's in it. Rocky Mountain was part of the Cranked series for a while there, and when I started shooting with the collective, Shimano was a big sponsor of all of their films, and I've been lucky enough to be with Shimano for a very long time as well. So those relationships have an effect.
And around 2001, I think, is Ride to the Hills, which is arguably one of the best early movies put out. I would think that puts you on the global map. You're not just, I mean, you are just the kid because I think that's what people call you, but you're a guy that people look at as this guy's going to have an impact on the sport when he gets bigger.
Yeah, that was the case. I mean, that was a great film, and it was one of the earliest projects I was a part of. I was definitely quite young at the time. I think I rode half my segment in that film on my last bike that I purchased, and about half of it on the Rocky. It was as I was breaking out.
This year as well, it's the first year of Rampage, and this is one of the most insane events in sports. When you first get to a venue like that, you're 16 or 17 years old, and you see the sheer size of everything. I don't know if you've ridden things like that in the North Shore or anywhere else, but when you get to Rampage for the first time, is it kind of a mind-blowing, scary experience?
Yes, it was. I hadn't seen anything like it before in person. I had seen some footage from down there from the Cranked films. I think Dave Watson had done some shooting down there, as well as the Ride to the Hill segment that was shot down there. You know, I'd seen it on film, but nothing really does it justice like being there in person.
Yeah.
So, yeah, showing up at that event was crazy, and still to this day, like, the most nervous I've ever been before any kind of bike event. I just remember the night before just lying in bed and staring at the ceiling, and I don't even know if I blinked.
When you were 16, 17, you're not sleeping the night before. But do things change when you've done it for 10 years? Because I would think every year you're upping the ante, and every year there's still a lot of nerves the night before the event. I think the last one you did was maybe 2012 or something like that. But when you were doing them every year, I mean, you were placing in the top 10 every year. To do that, you're trying to one-up yourself every year because eventually you want to be on that podium.
Yeah, it was something that got a little bit easier, but it was always nerves before the event because it did keep getting bigger. And yes, it was a very nerve-wracking event to be a part of. And if I'm being honest with myself, I never really dealt with the nerves that well to begin with. I have so much respect for the guys that do and that really rise to the occasion. But my experience with competitions in general is just, I've never really ridden my best at those events. I've always felt like I've ridden a little bit tight. So I don't think I dealt with the nerves as well as I could have.
In 2008, the year I think you took third and you got best trick, was there a different vibe going on in your head then? Were you a little bit looser, and is that why you did better?
Yeah, there was a lot going on that year. That was a crazy year for me. I had had a crash early that year. We were filming for Seasons, and it was about 6 or 7 months prior to the event, and I had the worst crash of my career by a long shot. Like, I'm lucky to be able to ride my bike after type of crash.
What happened?
We were filming in Utah, and I don't know. I guess the way I describe it is anytime you're riding down a trail, or obviously when you're shooting big jumps or lines, there's always kind of a worst case scenario that can happen. And I've always been a pretty calculated rider, and this particular situation, I took a fall and ended up in an area of the hill that I never even fathomed ending up in. And just took a massive fall off this big cliff and wrecked myself.
And how long does it take you to get back on the bike from there?
It took me about 3 months before I rode a downhill bike again, which was definitely sooner than they had told me. They first said probably about a year. So I was pretty lucky to be able to heal up that quickly and get on my bike. And I guess when I look back at that summer and think about the Rampage, I guess I went into the Rampage without as many expectations on myself. I was just stoked to be on my bike again and just to be there and compete. I wasn't riding for any kind of result. I was really just riding for myself and ended up having my best result ever. So go figure.
That takes all the pressure off you and you're able to get it done.
That's right.
As you progress through your career, you've been filming. We could list all your movies, but we're not going to do that because people can go online and see most of them. But you were repping the shit out of Rocky Mountain from the beginning of your career. And it seems like it's probably 2006-ish. They are going through some changes. Management has some big turnover, and internally it might start feeling like a different kind of brand for you. And around 2007-ish, things end. But what was going on internally that made you leave? Or I don't know how things ended with Rocky Mountain back then.
Well, to be perfectly honest with you, I don't really know. It was a strange situation. I was dealing with the general manager there at the time. We were talking about a new contract, and I certainly didn't want to go anywhere. And I basically just at one point was informed that my contract wasn't going to be renewed. And I never really got an answer why. That was it at that time. And the strange thing about the situation was that I had to sort of move on and find another opportunity. So I did. And then that particular general manager of Rocky at that time was let go 2 months after. And the new guy that came in reached out and asked what had happened. And I guess I sort of just let him know. And they certainly expressed some regret for the situation. And I guess they weren't really sure where that decision came from at the time. But yeah, it was just one of those things where I didn't want to leave. And I just had to sort of find a new opportunity based on what happened.
Are you pissed off or your feelings hurt or what happens? Because that's the brand that you've probably always wanted to be on from when you were a little kid. You get on them and then you have this new guy come in and communication's not there. And it can make people leave a brand with a really bad attitude towards them, which I don't think it did for you, but I don't know you. Were you pissed off then?
I was definitely bummed. That was 2008. So to sort of step back, I guess 1 year, I had spent 2007 almost the entire year shooting for seasons. And there might have been a sentiment, although I never heard this from Rocky. I did actually hear this sentiment from a couple of my other sponsors that maybe they hadn't seen as much of me that year as they wanted. And that definitely, like, I invested more time into that movie segment than I had anyone previous. That's for sure. And I was able to sort of bear the fruits of all that labor in 2008 when the film came out. But it's certainly true that 2007, I was off the grid for quite a while. Like I said, I never was told that that was the reason, but if I had to take a guess, maybe that had something to do with it.
When you look back, though, I would think there's no regrets on your end, because when you look at seasons, I mean, that has to be one of your favorite parts that you've put out. I mean, it was crazy lines that you're building with tons of features that all flow together, and it just showcases exactly what you were built to do. And I would think the dream of any athlete is to have a movie company willing to do exactly what they want to do for a segment.
Oh, certainly no regrets. No, I'm still really proud of that segment.
So you're in a position where you can go wherever you want, I would think, just based on what you've been doing, and you choose evil. And this is before they were the evil that they were today. But what made you, a nice, stable Canadian, make the move to the instability of evil at that time?
I was pretty excited by the opportunity to be involved with something from the very beginning. Also, there were some people involved that I really trusted. Gabe Fox, the guy that I mentioned before from the Cove Bike Shop, he was heavily involved. So yeah, I was excited by the prospect of starting with a brand from the very beginning and hopefully helping them establish themselves. And I think we did that very well to begin with, between myself and Stevie Smith on the downhill race side. I mean, I think we really did put evil on the map at the very beginning.
Oh, you sure did. And I would say the Evil years would be interesting because you're an established dude, their bikes are really good, but I think back then it was about getting one that was properly made. And did you ever get bad ones?
Well, we did face a lot of problems with producing the bikes, yeah, for sure. We were breaking a lot of them. They were just having some trouble making them at the factory in a way that they weren't failing on us, and there were some struggles those first years. We were breaking a lot of bikes.
Well, it seems like they've turned them around quite well.
Definitely.
When you go with a smaller core brand, Rocky Mountain's a core brand as well, but Evil's much smaller, there's differences, probably both positive and negative. And was it a huge change from what you know going to Evil?
It was a change, definitely. Stepping back to the very beginning of developing a bike platform, I feel like I learned a lot doing that, but it definitely also had its challenges. And it was amazing to work a bit with Dave Weigel. He is really good at what he does. Unfortunately, the downside was, we couldn't produce them in the way that they were holding together. And that was a challenge, definitely.
Were you more involved with bike design at Evil?
Actually, I would say no, because Dave Weigel was the one who designed the bike, and the bike design basically existed before I even started talking to them. So there is some sort of validation of the bike and the design and the technology, but in terms of major changes, the suspension layout and everything was already all designed by the time that we got there. So I wouldn't say so, no.
And while I'm on the topic of input, I think you try to have a lot of input with the brands and products you use, especially as you get older. And that's not true of everyone. I think that's what you call going the extra mile. But are there any products that you've concepted over the years that have become bestsellers that you can look at and be like, man, that was kind of my idea. I worked with the engineers and we put that thing out?
The early days at Rocky, when I started there, we were riding a bike called the RM7. And same sort of thing. It wasn't really up to the forces that we were putting through it. So I broke a lot of them. And I really, really pushed hard to have them evolve that bike and change it. And it was a little bit of a struggle. They didn't really want to hear from a 16-year-old kid how their bikes weren't good enough. But the bike that came out of that was the RMX. And that was an awesome bike. And I never broke one of those. I wouldn't say it was like my bike or anything, but I do feel like I had quite a bit to do with that one.
Okay. There's the science of building bikes, but there's the science of building lines too. I mean, there's science used in real stunt work all the time. They use math and other things like that. But with a lot of people in action sports, while everything's calculated and the goal is to figure out the right mix of speed, pop, and landing, it's usually not math being used. It's kind of like you're throwing a rock off something and be like, that's 20 feet. Do you use any science or is it all just feel?
Most of my years, it was feel. Yeah, the vast majority of it was feel. It was always sort of calculating speed, and I would always draw on past experiences or past lines, past jumps, and say like, yeah, okay, that one was about 40 feet, and this one's 45, so, how can I kind of figure out the speed for this? That was mostly feel. These days, guys are started to use numbers a little more. There's a build crew up in Kamloops that does a lot with speed guns, and I know being at like the first Fest event in Kamloops, they were gunning the run in for speed to get an idea of if this jump was doable. And that was kind of cool. But yeah, definitely mostly feel over the years.
There are things that can help in the parks. People started going to resi ramps and foam pits. It seems like speed guns and math might help what you're doing as well. But really, everybody's out there to have fun, and math is not fun.
No, I never had fun doing math, no.
Yeah, either have I. Now it is time for my final set of sponsors, and I'm going to start with Spy Optic. Spy has spent the past 25 years innovating the sunglass game, but more importantly, they've spent 25 years making you look good. To celebrate this 25th anniversary, Spy is re-releasing the MC3, an ode to Jeremy McGrath's original MC sunglass. The new Dirty Mo 2 is a sick update to Dale Jr.'s original Dirty Mo, and the Scoop 2 celebrates Spy's OG Scoop sunglasses, which started it all. If you wear sunglasses and listen to this podcast, it's time to support me, save some money, and make yourself look good. What I want you to do is head on over to spyoptic.com, pick out some sunglasses, head on over to checkout, and you are going to save 20% by entering the code POWEL20, that's all one word and the number 20, and you'll save 20% off. My final sponsor is the 10 Barrel Brewery out of Bend, Oregon. They have been brewing my favorite Northwest beer since 2006. But over the years, and even before they sponsored my podcast, they've been one of my favorite beer brands because they do so much for action sports. They're the first beer to produce their own ski and snowboard movie. They support a team of A-list athletes. They throw an incredible series of events with their Hella Big Air. And they have signature beers that donate to important causes like Protect Our Winners. If all of that isn't cool enough, the people that work at 10 Barrel, they're all people that like to drink beer outside. Next time you're at the store, please buy some 10 Barrel and support the brand that really makes a difference in the sports we love. To find out more about the beer, the pubs, and everything 10 Barrel, head on over to 10barrel.com. Those are my sponsors. Now let's jump back into the podcast. So when you're filming for a movie like Seasons, let's say, and you're building crazy, crazy lines, and you're not using science when you're building any of these, how long does it take you to build one of those lines? Because we see the videos and we know there's a build that goes into it, but how much time are you building compared to how much time you are actually writing?
That particular project, I think we built for at least 2 months. It might have been even 2.5, maybe even bordering on 3. It was a really challenging summer for building because it didn't rain much and the dirt there is super, super dry. So we kept having to import water, and we worked with a builder named Big Red Ted, and he basically lived there for 2 months. I would stop in every once in a while to help and do more of the line planning, and then he would do the line construction. But it was just a challenge. There was a lot of hours that went in there to building, like I said, somewhere between 2 and 3 months.
So everything's not like Rampage where you're building the whole line by yourself and your crew. Like you have Big Red Ted who's out there building most of the time and you don't have to do all the heavy lifting?
I didn't have to do all the heavy lifting. No, I did some heavy lifting, but my heavy lifting came when it was time to actually film it.
Yep.
Yeah, so then when we had all the lines in place, we showed up, and I think it took us a month and a half total. We battled some wind, a couple crashes, a couple small injuries, and we kept having to come back. And it was a very long shoot, very long process.
And when you have to come back, can other people poach what you've done, or is that what Big Red Ted is there for?
Well, Ted left when the building was done for the most part. Something like that would be such a poach that I don't think anybody would ever do that. There is kind of an unwritten sort of code in mountain biking, especially because we funded the build, like a project that size, and we've put a lot of resources and money and time into it. That would be a big poach.
You're just an asshole if you do that?
Yeah.
And you're not writing any other lines anywhere else because no one has any respect for you.
Yeah.
Totally understandable. So when you get towards the end of the Evil days, which is only, I think, about 2 years, what happens at Evil that makes you want to leave? Because it seemed like an exciting time to get in with a brand at the ground level, and then it's not anymore.
There were definitely a lot of challenges there. I won't go into all the details.
Sure.
It became pretty obvious that it was time to sort of move on and look for another fit again. And I guess I was lucky that, I had stayed in contact with Rocky, and there was a bunch of good people working there, and everyone agreed that it would be a good thing to reunite. So that's what happened.
When a guy of your stature in the bike industry goes to a small brand, sometimes a small struggling brand isn't big enough to support what you've already created in your career, and you have to go to a brand that can really market you, get you out there, and you can keep moving forward with your career.
I don't know. I mean, every situation is different and unique, and sales weren't going through the way everyone had hoped. And yeah, when that happens, it can cause issues.
So you get back on Rocky Mountain, back to what you know. But in 2010, it seems like you take a right turn in your career and you make the Canadian team. You're known as a free rider, and are your sponsors and people in general sort of stoked and confused at the same time? Like, wait, you want to leave all this freedom and go to structured, regimented riding?
Yeah, that's good. You did do your homework. That was a funny thing. I did get a few questions about it from some people, but it was kind of a fluke, to be honest. Like, my brother was really into racing at the time. He was trying to make a go of it racing, and that particular year, I just remember not having anything to do the week of Canadian Nationals, and he was driving out to Panorama to race, and I just just decided to go with them. And I hadn't raced in years. I had not raced in years. And we had a great time road tripping out there together and practicing the course, and really had no expectations. And then I think we finished second and third in the race. And those two results qualified both of us to make the nationals team and go to Worlds, which was in Mount St. Anne that year in Canada. So, I mean, yeah, I had a good laugh about it. And then I decided, well, if we're going to go to St. Anne, there's another World Cup the week before in Windham, New York. So we might as well go out for both of them. And that's what we did. We turned our little drive to Panorama into a couple-week flight across the country and had fun racing for a couple weeks.
So that was only a 2-week thing that you really raced?
Pretty much.
Okay.
Yeah. It was nationals, and then it was Windham World Cup, and then World Champs in Mount St. Anne.
And do you get anything for being part of the Canadian team other than maybe a jersey?
No, you don't really get anything other than, yeah, a jersey. You might even have to pay for that. I kind of forget. But you got to fund your whole trip and everything like that. But yeah, I'd raced Worlds in 2001 or 2, I believe, in Kaprun, Austria as a junior. And it was more just wanted an experience that I wanted to have with my brother. And I just thought it was cool and ended up having a blast. But yeah, I did have one or two sponsors sort of ask, like, oh, are you going to become a racer now? And I assured them that no, that wasn't the case.
Does that validate you to all the racers who've looked at your career and been like, well, he can't do what we do?
I think to a certain degree, yeah. Like, I think it probably gives me a bit of credibility in terms of, like, I appear in a lot of videos riding terrain fast. And I guess to, like, know that that rider can also compete at a World Cup and qualify for a final is somewhat validating, or yeah, it gives you a bit of credibility. I'm still such a fan of racing, and I watch every World Cup I can, and I have the utmost respect for those guys. And I would never say that I could just step into their world and compete with them legitimately. But, you know, to show up at a race and qualify for a final, I was stoked with that.
Is your headspace different in a race like that compared to like a Rampage where there's a lot of nerves?
Yeah, it was quite a bit different. I mean, I also knew that I hadn't been training the way that a World Cup racer trained. So my expectations were a little bit low. If anything, my only goal was to make the final, which is a top 80 at that time. To achieve that, I guess I surprised myself a little bit with where I ended up. I surpassed my expectations a bit.
Well, it sounds like from when you came off that injury in 2008 and got third at Rampage, and when you really weren't thinking that you had trained really hard for these World Cup races and you did well, it seems like when you don't put any pressure or expectations on yourself, things work out.
You might be onto something there.
I'll get to the business of biking a little bit because it's changed over the years. I mean, you still have the filming angle, and I think from 2012 on, you're filming every year and putting out new products, but there's more coaching for you. There's more product development. And when you look at your career, it's been going for 20 years, which is an eternity in action sports for anyone. How long do you think it can go, especially with older people getting into the sport more and more often, it seems like? Is this something that you can do into your 50s? Maybe not in the same respect, not riding as gnarly of terrain as just being the legendary Thomas Vanderham, and this is what he's riding now?
I think for one, it's been amazing to watch the sport evolve and evolve my riding, I guess, and my career with it. My job has changed a lot already over the years, from the beginning when it was all about jumping off the biggest cliff you could and working on a 3-minute video segment. I attribute something to that evolution as to why I'm still doing it now. It's definitely kept things interesting. It's kept things fresh. It's provided new challenges, and like, I couldn't be doing what I was doing when I was 17 now. No. And, you know, then there's been other elements, like trail bikes have come a long way, and those are the bikes that I now do the vast majority of my riding on. And that was good timing for me in terms of my riding, and the way that those bikes have emerged and what they're capable of now really allowed me to sort of shift and do a lot of filming on those type of bikes rather than having to, once again, hit the biggest stuff on my downhill bike. So can I do it till I'm 50? Probably not. I don't think I want to do it until I'm 50. At this point in my career, I'm really enjoying taking things year by year. And I also know that at some point it'll come to an end, and I'm pretty comfortable with that. At that point, I will stay working in the bike industry somewhere. And that's my plan.
Have you been smart with your money over the years? Do you own a house and maybe another property, or have you been good with that where when biking does end, you're not going to freak out and have to figure it out?
I'd like to think so. I've always been very aware that my career as a mountain biker is probably going to take the opposite trajectory to somebody in a more like quote unquote typical career where you start from the bottom and kind of work your way up. It's very likely for me that a lot of my income is going to be more front loaded in my career, and that at some point, if I do change what I do, I'm probably going to take a step back in terms of income. So I've definitely tried to plan for that. It's been an amazing exercise to be self-employed and do all your own planning and think about retirements. Nobody else is going to be planning for you for that stuff in this line of work. So I've always tried to pay close attention to it.
Well, you never hear anybody in these podcasts say the word retirement, so it seems like you're ahead of the curve there. Or plan for retirement, for that matter.
Well, save for retirement, whatever. Yeah.
Well, at this point in the show, I jump into something that I call inappropriate questions. And sometimes I get people to ask you 3 inappropriate questions, but in this case, I'm going to ask you 3 inappropriate questions here. The first one is, you were a young kid in the game when the game was just starting, and I would think there were a lot of loose folks at this point. They were veteran guys, and they were the legend of the sport. They were Richie, Wade, and Tippy. Can you tell us a wild story from the days when there were no rules with those guys?
I don't have too many wild ones with those guys. I mean, Wade always really likes to wrestle. We got in some pretty good wrestling matches over the years. That wasn't super wild or anything. One of the wildest things I think I saw was Stevie Smith stab Steve Pete with like a barbecue fork late night. One night, it was when we were shooting Seasons. We were all staying up in this house in Whistler, and we had a pretty big night, and I think Petey dared Stevie to stab him with this barbecue fork, and he did it.
I don't know what's dumber, daring someone to stab you or actually stabbing someone.
Yeah.
Question number 2, you've been in the spotlight for almost 20 years, and this is going to be a 2-part question. What is the dumbest fan request, whether in person or over the internet, that you have received that you still shake your head over?
I mean, you get the odd fan like asking you to send them your bike or something like that. I guess that's the first thing that comes to mind.
I was expecting you to say underwear, but you said bike.
No, not underwear. I haven't got too many weird ones.
Okay. What is the dumbest thing you've ever done for money other than your deodorant commercial?
The deodorant commercial was pretty dumb.
Did they make you feel and look stupid and all your friends had to see it on TV and be like, God, I can't believe you did that?
Oh, yeah, for sure. And it ran like a lot all through the hockey playoffs and stuff. So, yeah, I got my fair share of barbs for that one, but it did pay well.
My last question, I could go into asking questions about your drunkest and most stupid night. Actually, do you have a drunk and stupid story for us, or do you want to keep those to yourself?
Yeah, I'll keep those to myself.
Okay, I usually don't give an out like that, but I gave you one there. But I'm going to guess, being as talented as you are on a bike and having that natural talent, that you're probably one of those people that are good at anything they really set their minds to. Is there anything you absolutely suck at?
Yeah, there is. Water sports in general, I'm not very good. Surfing in particular, I'm just not comfortable in the ocean. And I've been surfing a handful of times, and I mean, I wouldn't call it anything close to surfing. But yeah, I'd say in the sports realm, water sports is my weakness.
Are you a good swimmer?
Not really.
Is it one of those things you can notice like, hey, he can't even swim?
No, not like that. I'm just not like a strong swimmer.
Okay. Well, we are at the end of the podcast. I want to thank you for your time, and just looking at your career, man, it's like you've been a pro forever. I mean, you're second generation, but those first generation guys were riding with you when you were a little kid and you were like the little guy around. You have so much history, but you're only 35, which is really amazing in any of these sports. So thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. My pleasure.
So that was time with Thomas Vanderham, and he really seems like a class act. When you listen to his answers, he makes sure he throws no one under the bus, he doesn't offend anyone, and he's still able to tell things how they happened. I think that's what happens when you get a job at such a young age, and that's what happened to Thomas. While most people don't figure out what they're going to do until their 20s, Thomas made that hard decision at 18, and he's never looked back. And really, the path starts at 15 for Thomas, which in the world of adults, sponsors, and travel can turn a kid into an adult really fast. I meant to ask Thomas about that, if he felt like he lost a little bit of his childhood due to becoming a professional mountain biker so young. But I didn't ask that, and it doesn't really matter. 20 years later, Thomas is still crushing it on his bike. He's done a lot more than he's missed out on, that's for sure. And that's the show for this week. I want to thank everyone for listening. If you have any questions or concerns, my email is mike@thepowellmovement.com, and I will get back to you. Finally, I want to thank Evo, Stanley, Optic, and the 10 Barrel Brewery for all of their support. Have a great week, everyone.